This woman went from struggling to pay her rent in a freezing apartment to pretending to be the fiancée of a billionaire. But a fake relationship spiraled into something really absurd that she never expected, not even in her worst nightmares. She faced ruthless family scrutiny, a mysterious ex, and the weight of a world she thought she could never belong to. Risk everything for a shot at happiness? Or will their differences tear them apart forever? I'm your host, Josh, and it's an absolute pleasure to share this story with you. Emma Carter knew exactly two things that snowy December night. She was broke, and she was freezing. If there were an award for the world's worst heating system, her apartment would have won it. Sure, it was the cheapest studio she could find in New York City, but she'd never expected to wear 2 sweaters, a scarf, and a hat just to survive indoors. Here she was, clutching her one small luxury, a peppermint mocha, as her best friend Jess rattled off plans she barely heard over the noise of her own worries. "Emma!" Jess snapped her fingers, pulling her out of her thoughts. "Did you hear a word I just said? Something about money?" Emma guessed, giving a reluctant sip of her drink. She'd been so focused on scraping together enough to cover rent and bills that she barely heard herself think most days. Jess rolled her eyes. "No, I was saying you need to get out of here, away from the stress. There's a Christmas charity gala uptown tonight, and it's full of people who actually buy art, not just look at it. Who knows, you might even sell a painting or two." Emma cringed. The last thing she wanted was to go hobnobbing with rich strangers. Her idea of networking usually involved posting her art on social media and hoping for the best. But Jess looked ready to drag her out by force. "I don't have anything nice to wear," Emma argued, glancing down at her beat-up sneakers. "And besides, what am I even supposed to say? Hi, I'm Emma, and I paint struggling cityscapes inspired by my tragically underheated apartment." Jess grinned, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "That's what makes you real. Rich people eat that up. They love the underdog charm. Come on, I've got the perfect dress for you." Emma sighed, weighing her options. She could stay here, freezing in her studio, or let Jess parade her around like some kind of quirky novelty. The idea was mortifying, but her wallet was empty. Her bills were piling up, and she was so close to giving up on her dream that it scared her. "Fine, but I swear if anyone calls me quirky, I'm out." 2 hours later, Emma stood at the grand doors of the Delacorte Hall, tugging at the sleeves of the sleek emerald green dress Jess had lent her. Somehow, it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she belonged here. The gala was exactly what she'd dreaded. Marble floors polished to an almost mirror shine, chandeliers that looked like they cost more than her entire apartment, and a sea of people laughing as if they'd never known a bad day in their lives. The place was practically dripping in elegance, and Emma had never felt more out of place. "Just think of it like a game," Jess whispered in her ear before disappearing into the crowd. "Spot someone who looks like they want to buy art and just be yourself." Emma forced herself to smile as she wandered over to the refreshment table, where plates of tiny, perfectly decorated pastries were arranged in a display she couldn't afford to touch. She was about to reach for one when a voice beside her said, "Careful. One bite of those and you'll need a small loan to cover it." Emma turned, finding herself face to face with a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a GQ magazine. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with a hint of something wry in his smile, he was annoyingly handsome. The kind of guy who probably had his suits custom-tailored and his coffee flown in from some mountain in Peru. "Good thing I came here for the ambiance," she replied, folding her arms. The man chuckled. "Let me guess, Jess dragged you here. You don't seem like the gala type." Emma raised an eyebrow, trying not to show how on the nose he was. "That obvious?" He shrugged, looking amused. "You have that look, like you'd rather be anywhere else. I get it. This crowd can be a bit much." "Then what are you doing here?" she shot back. "Let me guess, hedge fund manager?" He smirked, clearly entertained. "Close, just Daniel Prescott." Her jaw tightened in surprise. Daniel Prescott, CEO, billionaire, and the kind of guy who made headlines in magazines she could only read while waiting in line at the grocery store. He had that effortless charm, like he was born with a yacht and a pair of aviator sunglasses. "Right, of course you're just Daniel Prescott," she muttered, trying not to cringe at her earlier sarcasm. He tilted his head, studying her with interest. "And you are Emma Carter, painter of cold apartments and unpaid bills," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "An artist," he mused, sounding genuinely intrigued. "You're different. And maybe a little too honest for this crowd." Emma felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "Well, that's the charm of not being rich. It's easy to be honest when you've got nothing to lose." He chuckled, but something in his expression softened, like her words had touched on something personal. "Tell you what, Emma," he said. "I actually have a proposition for you." Emma crossed her arms, feeling a flash of skepticism. "This better not be one of those rich guy tricks where you offer me exposure in exchange for free work." He laughed, and for the first time she noticed how it transformed his face, softening the sharpness of his jaw. "Not quite. I need a fiancé." She blinked, her brain struggling to process. "Excuse me?" "A fake fiancé," he clarified. "My family's convinced I'm incapable of stability, and they're making my life miserable. But if I show up with someone real, someone authentic, like you, it might just get them off my back. I'd pay you, of course." Emma let out a laugh of disbelief. This had to be some kind of joke. "You want me to pretend to be your fiancé? That's insane." He shrugged, his gaze never leaving hers. "I'm serious. All expenses paid, plus a handsome fee. You'd only need to pretend for a week, just until Christmas." A week until Christmas. And she'd be paid? It sounded too good to be true. And yet, the thought of stability, even temporary, was too tempting to ignore. "What's the catch?" Daniel's expression softened, his polished CEO demeanor fading just enough to reveal something real, almost vulnerable. "No catch. Just play the part. Convince my family I'm a normal guy. Maybe make a few appearances. Do this, and I'll make sure your financial worries are over. At least for a while." Emma crossed her arms, her mind racing. On one hand, it was ridiculous. But on the other, what did she have to lose? Taking a deep breath, she looked Daniel in the eye. "Fine. I'll do it." Emma had always thought that the inside of a private jet would feel like stepping into a spaceship. It turns out, it just felt like stepping into a different reality. A plush, luxuriously quiet world where no one seemed to worry about affordable anything. She sank into her seat, her fingers grazing the leather. If anyone had told her 24 hours ago that she'd be here, on a private jet to Vermont with New York City's most eligible bachelor, she would have laughed them off. But there was Daniel Prescott, sitting across from her, scrolling through his tablet, as if whisking her away for a week-long Christmas charade was just another item on his to-do list. She glanced at him, trying to make sense of this mysterious, polished man who apparently needed a fake fiancé to convince his family he was capable of settling down. "So, how are we doing this?" she asked. He looked up, brows raised. "Doing what?" "This," she replied, gesturing between them. "The whole fake fiancé act. Don't we need a backstory?" Daniel set his tablet aside, a hint of amusement flickering across his face. "Keep it simple, fewer chances of slipping up. Let's say we met at one of my events. I saw your art, was captivated, and the rest is history." Emma snorted. "As if I've ever had an art show." Her life felt worlds away from this man's. No curated gallery shows, no effortlessly charming meet-cutes. "Try again." "Fine," he said, chuckling. "We met at a charity event last year. I thought you were refreshingly honest and different from the usual crowd. You're not like anyone I've met before." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Is that a line you practice?" He shrugged, not looking the least bit apologetic. "Not at all, but it'll probably charm my mother. She's my toughest critic. Now what about your likes and dislikes? Besides surviving in an underheated apartment, of course." She gave him a feigned look of offense. "Wow, really knows how to woo a girl, doesn't he?" But she cracked a smile anyway. "Fine, let's see. I paint, I drink way too much coffee, and I probably spend too much time watching old movies." Daniel nodded, looking at her with genuine interest. "Got it. Painting, coffee, classic movies. I'll impress all your imaginary friends with how well I know you." Emma rolled her eyes, but the banter felt surprisingly natural. As they continued swapping details, she found herself laughing, really laughing. And, as strange as it was, she felt herself relaxing around him. Maybe it was the absence of expectations, or the knowledge that this was temporary, just a role they'd both agreed to play. But she couldn't deny that she was curious about the man behind the polished exterior. By the time they landed in Vermont, she almost felt like she'd known him longer than just a few hours. Almost. Arriving at the Prescott estate felt like walking into a postcard. Snow blanketed the grounds, dusting the tall pines in sparkling white. The mansion loomed ahead, an architectural wonder of frosted windows, ivy-covered archways, and holiday lights twinkling like something from a dream. It was beautiful, magical even, but it also reminded her just how far out of her depth she was. "Wow," she breathed, hugging her coat around her as they walked up the driveway. Daniel glanced over, his expression unreadable. "It's home," he said, almost begrudgingly. Emma raised an eyebrow. "You say that like it's a bad thing." He didn't respond, just led her up the steps and through the massive front doors. The grand foyer was even more stunning, with a chandelier the size of her studio casting a warm glow over everything. As she took in the opulence, she couldn't help but feel like she'd stumbled into a world where she didn't belong. Daniel's family was waiting, lined up with polite smiles that felt just a little too curious. Emma instinctively straightened her posture, feeling a flicker of nerves she hadn't anticipated. Daniel leaned down, his voice low and reassuring. "Just relax. They're more bark than bite." She forced a smile, but her heart was pounding. "Easy for you to say. You're not pretending to be engaged to you." He chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. "True, but if it helps, they're more interested in appearances than details. Just smile, look impressed, and you'll be fine." "Look impressed," she muttered under her breath. "Got it." As they approached, Daniel's mother, an elegant woman with eyes as sharp as her dress, stepped forward. Her gaze swept over Emma with a brief, practiced smile. "So, this is the young woman who's captured Daniel's heart," she said, her tone polite but unmistakably skeptical. Emma offered her best smile, channeling every bit of confidence she could muster. "Mrs. Prescott, thank you for welcoming me. Your home is beautiful." Margaret Prescott raised an eyebrow, clearly assessing Emma. "Please, call me Margaret." Her gaze flicked back to Daniel, her expression softening slightly, as she continued with introductions. Emma met Daniel's siblings, his older brother, Andrew, whose nod was as curt as his tailored suit, and his younger sister, Lily, who at least offered a genuine smile. "Oh, Emma," Margaret said, turning back to her with a smile that was both warm and probing. "Tell us, what was it that made you fall for Daniel?" Emma's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm, remembering the story they'd practiced. "Honestly, it was his sense of humor," she said, glancing at Daniel with a small, conspiratorial smile. "He's not as serious as he looks. He can actually be pretty funny once you get past the whole brooding businessman act." Margaret's mouth twitched, possibly amused, possibly not. "Is that so?" She turned to Daniel with a look that Emma couldn't quite read. "Well, perhaps we'll see that side of him yet." Before Emma could respond, Daniel's arm slipped around her waist, grounding her with a warmth that felt surprisingly comforting. "I'll give Emma the tour," he said smoothly, leading her away before she had to endure another round of curious questions. As they walked through the massive halls, she let out a long breath. "Is it always this intense?" Daniel laughed, guiding her down a corridor lined with family portraits. "Welcome to the family. Don't take it personally. My mother has an eye for detail. She notices everything." Emma tried to shake off her nerves, glancing at the portraits as they passed. "Right. Well, if she tries to eat me alive, I hope you'll step in." Daniel looked down at her, his expression softening. "I've got your back, Emma. Promise." For a moment, the space between them felt closer, warmer. But then he cleared his throat, the moment passing as quickly as it had come. "Come on. We've got a long week ahead of us." She smiled, following him up the grand staircase. But as she did, she couldn't shake the feeling that this pretend arrangement was beginning to feel a little too real. Emma stood in the guest room, taking in the luxury around her, feeling as if she'd wandered into a scene from an old movie. High ceilings, intricate crown molding, a fireplace that looked older than her entire apartment building. It was all too much. She traced her fingers along the silky bedspread, wondering how something could be so perfect and yet so uninviting at the same time. She leaned against the tall window, peering out over the snowy grounds. The vast, manicured landscape looked like a winter wonderland, each snow-covered tree and twinkling light reminding her just how far she was from her own world. As beautiful as it all was, the estate felt like it belonged to someone else, like she was peeking into a life she didn't fit into. A knock on her door made her jump. She turned to find a maid, a real maid, complete with a perfectly pressed uniform, who informed her that the Prescott family was waiting in the dining room. Emma swallowed, trying to hide her surprise, and nodded. She'd been warned by Daniel about the family's formal, casual dinners, but nothing could have prepared her for the opulence of the dining room. The long table gleamed beneath a chandelier, its crystal prisms casting rainbows across pristine white linens. The place settings were precise, silverware polished to perfection, and the warm glow from the candles created an almost unreal scene. She took a seat beside Daniel, feeling every pair of eyes in the room sweep over her. She'd never felt more like an outsider, and the weight of it pressed down on her as the rest of the family settled around the table. Lily, Daniel's younger sister, offered her a friendly smile as she sat down on Emma's other side. "Emma, you look fantastic. Daniel has such great taste, doesn't he?" Emma forced a smile, grateful for the hint of warmth. "Thank you. And yes, he does." She glanced at Daniel, who gave her a reassuring nod, his expression unreadable but steady. Across the table, Margaret was watching her with the kind of calm interest that made Emma's skin prickle. The Prescott matriarch wasn't unkind, but there was a steeliness to her gaze that felt like she was assessing every inch of Emma, from her clothes to her posture. "So, Emma," Margaret began, her voice as smooth as silk but with an unmistakable edge. "How long have you and Daniel known each other?" Emma blinked, momentarily thrown off by the formality. Just over a year," she replied, glancing at Daniel for confirmation. Daniel nodded smoothly, jumping in. "We met at an art event last year. I bought one of Emma's paintings. It reminded me of my early days in the city." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Oh? Which painting was that, Daniel?" Emma's heart skipped a beat, but Daniel didn't miss a beat. "It was a small piece. A New York street corner. Moody, honest. It had Emma's signature style." Emma let out a silent sigh of relief, amazed at how smoothly he'd filled in the gaps. It struck her how easily he navigated this world, every word carefully chosen, every move controlled. She felt like she was holding her breath, trying to keep up. Margaret nodded, her approval subtle, but there. "I see. It's wonderful to have you here, Emma. I'm sure it must be quite a change for you." Emma's cheeks warmed, but she forced herself to keep her smile. "It is, but thank you. Your home is lovely." Dinner continued in a whirl of courses and carefully steered conversation, led mostly by Daniel's older brother, Andrew, who seemed more interested in discussing quarterly projections than the holidays. Emma felt herself fading into the background, not entirely sure how to contribute. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being watched, studied, as if everyone in the room were waiting to see if she'd slip up. At one point, Andrew turned to her, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So, Emma," he began, his tone polite but sharp, "what was it that first attracted you to my brother?" Emma felt the weight of every gaze around the table, her pulse quickening. She forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "Honestly, it was his sense of humor," she said, glancing at Daniel. "He's not as serious as he looks. He can actually be pretty funny." Andrew raised an eyebrow, as if the concept of funny was foreign when applied to his brother. "Funny? That's a new one." Lily jumped in with a grin. "Well, I think it's cute. Daniel bringing someone home for Christmas? It's about time." She raised her glass in a little toast. "To Daniel and Emma." Emma smiled, her cheeks warming as everyone followed suit, raising their glasses with polite nods and murmurs of agreement. The toast felt oddly formal, and she couldn't help but feel like she was an actress playing a role, her lines memorized and rehearsed. As the meal finally wound down, Daniel leaned over, his voice low and comforting. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his hand brushing hers under the table. The touch was so brief, she almost wondered if she'd imagined it, but it left her feeling steadier, more grounded. After dinner, Daniel led her to a cozy sitting room, complete with a roaring fire and plush armchairs that felt like sinking into a cloud. For the first time since she'd arrived, Emma felt herself begin to relax. "How was that for a first impression?" Daniel asked, leaning against the arm of her chair, his gaze soft and slightly teasing. Emma let out a short laugh. "Honestly, it felt like I was being interviewed for a job. And your mother, she's intense." He chuckled, nodding. "That she is. But don't take it personally. My mother's been preparing me for the role of Prescott heir since before I could talk." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Is it exhausting, playing this part?" He shrugged, looking away. It's what's expected of me. I can't really change that. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling as she watched him, studying the way his usual guardedness softened in the quiet glow of the room. She could see the weight he carried, the expectations of his family pressing down on him. And for the first time, she felt a flicker of empathy. They were different in so many ways, yet the pressure to be something they weren't was a feeling she understood all too well. Daniel looked over at her, his gaze thoughtful. You know, you handled yourself well tonight. My mother actually seemed impressed. That's rare. Emma snorted, glancing back toward the dining room. I think I lost a piece of my soul back there, but thanks. He laughed, and for a moment, the guarded CEO facade dropped, leaving just the man underneath. A man who looked, just for an instant, vulnerable. Don't worry, he said softly. I've got your back. Her heart skipped, the words carrying a warmth that felt too real, too close to everything she was trying not to feel. She looked away, a small smile tugging at her lips. Good, because I have a feeling I'm going to need it. As he walked her back to her room, she found herself lingering in the warmth of his presence, wondering how much of this pretend relationship was actually pretend after all. Emma wasn't sure what to expect when Daniel's mother had announced that tea with the family would take place outdoors. And yet, here she was, trudging through the snowy grounds of the Prescott estate in a pair of elegant snowshoes, courtesy of Margaret Prescott. Her heart pounded with each unsteady step, and she couldn't help feeling like she was part of some royal winter expedition. This is tea? She whispered to Daniel as they navigated the winding path. Pretty sure I left my kettle back in my apartment. He chuckled, looking remarkably at ease in his own snowshoes. The tea comes later. This is my mother's favorite Christmas tradition. Think of it as a way to experience the beauty of winter, as she always says. Emma glanced around at the snow-covered trees, the landscape so perfectly serene, it seemed like a backdrop in one of her own paintings. She had to admit, as strange as it was, there was something enchanting about it, something that felt like stepping out of time. So, what exactly are we supposed to be experiencing? She asked, stumbling slightly as she tried to keep up with his steady pace. Daniel shot her an amused glance. The beauty, of course. He gestured to the world around them, his voice softening. My mother thinks there's something grounding about walking through nature. She claims it reminds us of who we are. Emma huffed, more from effort than anything else. That sounds nice, but I think I'm already pretty grounded by my day job. Thank you very much. Daniel laughed, the sound echoing warmly through the trees. I imagine your idea of grounding looks different from hers. They walked in silence for a few minutes, taking in the quiet beauty around them, the muffled crunch of their steps the only sound in the otherwise untouched snow. Emma glanced at him, seeing him relaxed in a way he rarely seemed inside the mansion. He didn't have the same guardedness or formal politeness out here. He was just Daniel, walking alongside her. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence. This life, all the expectations? He looked at her, his face thoughtful. Sometimes, it's easy to feel like I'm always being watched, always performing, but it's all I've known. Emma nodded, feeling a pang of understanding. She'd spent her life trying to break free from expectations, not fulfill them. Yet here they were, two people from entirely different worlds, each searching for something they couldn't quite name. They made their way back to the mansion, where an impressive tea service awaited them by a roaring fire. The snowshoe experience had drawn everyone together, bringing a quiet camaraderie to the group that Emma hadn't expected. Margaret presided over the gathering with her usual cool elegance, but Emma noticed a hint of warmth in her gaze as she served everyone cups of tea. As she took her seat, Emma caught Margaret watching her with that same assessing look she'd given her the night before. Emma, dear, she began smoothly, have you ever thought about your own family traditions? The things you'll pass down one day? Emma blinked, surprised by the question. I guess I haven't really thought about it, she said, feeling strangely exposed. Margaret's eyes softened slightly, though the edge in her gaze remained. Family traditions are essential, don't you think? They remind us of who we are, where we come from. For people like us, they're what hold us together. Emma forced a polite smile, but a familiar ache stirred in her chest. She thought of her tiny apartment back in the city, the makeshift decorations she'd strung up to bring a hint of the season into her life. She thought of her childhood, where holidays were simple and modest. Nothing like this grand display. Daniel caught her gaze and gave her a small, understanding nod, as if he could sense her discomfort. "Actually, Emma and I started our own tradition," he said smoothly, breaking the tension. "We made gingerbread houses together last year. Hers was a masterpiece. Mine, not so much." Lily's eyes lit up. "Oh, we always make gingerbread houses on Christmas Eve. You should join us tonight, Emma. It's our one truly chaotic tradition." Emma felt her spirits lift. "That sounds fun. I can't promise any masterpieces, but I'll give it my best shot." But that evening, Emma found herself at the massive kitchen island, surrounded by the Prescott family, and a dizzying array of frosting and candy. The energy in the room felt different from the formal dinners and quiet tea. It was lively, relaxed, the sort of chaos that made her feel more at home. Lily handed her an apron with a grin. "Prepare yourself. Daniel's competitive, but his designs are ambitious. Last year, he attempted a modern architectural masterpiece that collapsed in 10 minutes. Daniel rolled his eyes but didn't deny it. I have higher hopes for this year's model." As they got to work, Emma felt the day's tension melt away. She laughed as she and Daniel argued over frosting techniques, shared candy, and joked about their families. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wasn't thinking about what anyone else thought. She was just Emma, building a gingerbread house, laughing alongside people who were starting to feel a little bit like family. Margaret wandered into the kitchen halfway through, her gaze sweeping over the mess they'd created with a raised eyebrow, though she didn't scold them. Instead, she simply observed, her expression unreadable as she watched Daniel and Emma working together. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was studying her, as if trying to solve a puzzle. But for once, Emma didn't mind. She met Margaret's gaze with a small, steady smile, then turned back to her gingerbread house, adding the final touches to the roof with a steady hand. Whatever Margaret thought of her, it no longer felt like the defining factor in who she was. As they cleaned up, Daniel glanced over at her, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You did well today," Emma grinned, brushing a stray bit of frosting from her arm. "Not too bad for a starving artist." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're more than that, Emma." She looked up at him, her heart skipping a beat at the warmth in his gaze. For a moment, it felt like he could see through all the layers she kept hidden, as if he understood the person she was beneath her insecurities. And in that moment, standing in the soft glow of the kitchen lights, she felt something shift between them, something that felt real, solid, like the beginning of something she wasn't ready to name. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly shy. He reached over, brushing a stray bit of frosting from her cheek, his touch warm and familiar. "Anytime." As they made their way back to their rooms, Emma's heart felt lighter. For the first time, she wondered if there might be a place for her in this world, a space where she could belong, not as a visitor, but as someone who was truly, deeply wanted. After a day spent navigating the Prescott family's holiday traditions, Emma finally had a quiet moment to herself. She curled up in the sitting room, a cup of tea warming her hands as she stared into the flickering fire. The Prescott mansion was both breathtaking and intimidating, a place so rich in beauty that it made her feel small, like she didn't belong. She heard footsteps approaching and looked up, surprised to see Daniel walking in, his hands tucked into his pockets. He looked different in the soft firelight, more relaxed, like the weight of his family's expectations had softened a little. "Long day?" he asked, a small smile on his lips. Emma nodded, smiling back. "Survived snowshoeing and a formal tea. I feel like I've been through a holiday boot camp." Daniel laughed, taking a seat across from her. "I know. My mother has a way of turning everything into a family event." Emma looked at him, curious. "Do you ever get tired of it? The rules, the rituals, always being on for people?" He leaned back, his gaze thoughtful as he watched the fire. "I used to. When I was younger, I thought it was all a little stifling. But now, I guess I'm just used to it. It's what's expected of me." Emma understood that feeling more than she'd expected. She was always trying to live up to her own expectations, making ends meet, pushing herself to create meaningful art despite the odds. They were different struggles, but the weight felt familiar. She glanced at him, feeling her heart beat a little faster. "You know, this whole fake fiancé thing, I don't think I could do it with anyone but you." He looked over at her, his gaze softening. "I feel the same way. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, as if he were treading into unfamiliar territory. The warmth of his words settled around her like a blanket, and for a moment, she let herself believe that maybe there was more here than just a charade. She looked down, trying to keep her voice steady. This doesn't feel fake anymore. At least, not to me. Daniel leaned forward, his hand reaching across to brush hers. Emma, I don't want it to be fake. Her breath caught, the words filling the space between them with a possibility she hadn't dared to hope for. She looked up at him, her heart racing, and for a second, she thought he might lean closer. But then a voice interrupted, sharp and unmistakable. Danny! Emma's heart sank as a woman appeared in the doorway, tall and striking in a way that made Emma feel immediately self-conscious. Her dark hair was swept back elegantly, and she radiated confidence, the kind that only came with wealth and status. The way she looked at Daniel, warm, possessive, sent an uncomfortable jolt through Emma's chest. Olivia, Daniel said, standing up. His voice was polite, but there was a tension in his posture that Emma hadn't seen before. Olivia's gaze flicked to Emma, giving her a quick, dismissive once-over before she turned back to Daniel. I didn't know you'd be here this Christmas, she said smoothly. I was hoping we could catch up. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice guarded. Olivia, this is Emma, my fiancée. Emma felt the weight of the word as he said it, a strange mix of pride and discomfort settling over her. Olivia's gaze shifted back to her, a cold smile tugging at her lips. Fiancé? I had no idea Daniel was even dating. Congratulations. Emma, was it? Emma forced a smile, though her insides were twisting. Thank you. Olivia turned her attention back to Daniel, her smile widening. We should get coffee sometime, just the two of us, for old time's sake. Emma watched as Daniel's jaw tightened, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Maybe, he said non-committally, glancing at Emma. But we're pretty busy over the holidays. Olivia raised an eyebrow, her smile never faltering. Well, I'm sure we'll cross paths. After all, it's a small world. With a final lingering look at Daniel, she turned and walked away, leaving Emma feeling like she'd just been caught in a chilly draft. Emma stood there, trying to gather her thoughts. She felt small, out of place, and the warmth of her earlier conversation with Daniel had faded, replaced by a sharp, unwelcome pang of jealousy. So, she said after a long silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Old friend? Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Something like that. Olivia and I, we have a bit of history. Emma forced a laugh, hoping it sounded light. Oh, so she's the beautiful, mysterious ex. He looked at her, his gaze serious. Emma, she's part of my past. I chose you to be here with me, not her. But despite his words, Emma couldn't shake the insecurity that Olivia's arrival had stirred. She was Daniel's fiancée on paper, sure, but Olivia belonged in this world in a way she never could. The fear she'd kept buried since she arrived, the feeling that she'd always be an outsider in his world, was now a heavy weight on her chest. I get it, she said softly, though her voice felt strained. But it's hard not to feel, I don't know, like I don't belong here. He reached for her hand, his expression earnest. Emma, you're the one I want here. None of this means anything if it's not with you. His words settled around her, both reassuring and terrifying. She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall into this strange, beautiful life they were creating together. But Olivia's shadow hung between them, a reminder of the line that separated Emma's life from his. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire. Emma knew that her feelings were growing stronger, tangled with all the fears and insecurities she'd tried so hard to ignore. And for the first time, she wondered if letting herself believe in this love, this new life with Daniel, was worth the risk of heartbreak. The morning after the Christmas Eve ball, Emma couldn't shake the feelings of doubt that had taken root the night before. She'd spent most of the night watching Daniel and Olivia exchange glances across the ballroom. Olivia was poised and graceful, moving effortlessly among the Prescott family and their guests, her charm blending seamlessly with the elegance of the event. Meanwhile, Emma had felt like a child playing dress-up, wondering if everyone could see right through her. As she made her way down the mansion's winding staircase, she couldn't help but feel like an imposter. Her mind kept replaying Olivia's smile, the way she'd looked at Daniel with that unspoken confidence, as if they shared a world Emma would never understand. Daniel found her wandering the hallway, his eyes softening as he approached. "Hey, are you okay?" She forced a smile, hoping it looked genuine. "Yeah, just taking in the holiday atmosphere." He raised an eyebrow, seeing through her forced cheerfulness. "Emma, if something's wrong, you can tell me." Emma hesitated, debating whether to voice her insecurities. She wanted to trust him, to believe his words from last night. But her doubts lingered, and the thought of asking about Olivia felt too vulnerable, too raw. "I'm fine," she said, keeping her voice light. "It's just been a long week." Daniel nodded, though his eyes lingered on her, searching for something she wasn't ready to give. After a beat, he reached out, brushing his fingers against hers. The touch was brief, but it grounded her, a silent reminder of the moments they'd shared that felt real, no matter how much she tried to tell herself otherwise. But just as quickly as he touched her hand, he stepped back, his expression shifting as he glanced down the hallway. Emma followed his gaze and saw Olivia approaching, a radiant smile on her face as she called out to Daniel. The sight of her sent a fresh pang of jealousy through Emma's chest. "Daniel, there you are. I was hoping to catch you before breakfast," Olivia said, her tone warm and familiar. She glanced briefly at Emma, a hint of condescension in her smile. "Emma," she said smoothly, her voice dripping with false politeness. Emma gave a tight nod, hoping it looked calm, even though her heart pounded with discomfort. She didn't want to let Olivia see how affected she was, didn't want her to know she was getting under her skin. Daniel, sensing the tension, offered a polite but firm smile to Olivia. "Actually, I need to talk to Emma. Excuse us?" Olivia raised an eyebrow, her expression shifting to something between surprise and amusement. "Of course, but don't be a stranger, Danny." Emma clenched her jaw, feeling a fresh wave of anger and hurt wash over her. She wanted to shrug it off, to remind herself that this was all temporary, a performance they were putting on for his family. But the doubt that Olivia had planted was now a fully grown thorn, making it impossible to ignore. When Olivia walked away, Daniel turned back to her, his gaze steady. "Emma, I don't want you to feel threatened by her. Olivia's part of my past. She doesn't matter anymore." Emma forced a laugh, hoping it masked the sting of her words. "Doesn't she, though? She seems to think otherwise. And from what I can tell, you two share a lot of history." "History doesn't mean anything if it's over," he said quietly. "You're the one here with me now, Emma. You're the one who matters." The sincerity in his voice softened her anger, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Olivia would always be a lingering presence in his life. It was like a shadow she couldn't outrun, a reminder that she would always be the outsider in his world. They made their way to breakfast, where the family gathered around a table covered in platters of pastries, fruit, and coffee. Emma tried to push her doubts aside, smiling politely and answering questions as Daniel's family peppered her with curious looks and subtle assessments. But every time she caught sight of Olivia at the other end of the table, laughing with Daniel's mother, or exchanging knowing glances with his brother, her chest tightened. After breakfast, Emma slipped out onto the terrace, breathing in the cool winter air as she tried to gather her thoughts. The weight of her insecurities, her doubts, was beginning to feel like more than she could bear. She wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend to belong here, in this world of perfect smiles and polite facades. "Emma?" Daniel's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to find him standing behind her, his face etched with concern. "You've been quiet all morning. Are you sure you're okay?" Emma hesitated, trying to put her feelings into words without sounding irrational. "Daniel, do you ever wonder if we're just fooling ourselves?" He frowned, taking a step closer. "What do you mean?" She looked away, wrapping her arms around herself. "You come from this world of wealth, of tradition, and status. And I'm just an artist from a one-bedroom apartment in the city. I don't fit in here. And maybe I never will." Daniel's expression softened, and he reached out, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Emma, you fit in with me. That's what matters." She wanted to believe him, but her heart still ached with doubt. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "But will it always be enough? Because sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending to be someone I'm not." Before he could respond, Olivia appeared in the doorway, her presence breaking the intimacy of the moment. She gave them both a tight, polite smile, her gaze lingering a little too long on Daniel. "Sorry to interrupt," she said smoothly. "But Daniel, your mother wanted a word." Daniel nodded, though his gaze remained on Emma. "I'll be back soon. Don't go anywhere." Emma forced a smile, watching as he walked away with Olivia trailing behind him. She tried to tell herself that he'd chosen her, that she was the one he wanted, but the doubt remained, an ache she couldn't shake. After a few minutes, Emma made her way back inside, her heart heavy with unresolved feelings. She spotted Daniel in the hallway, speaking in hushed tones with his mother and Olivia. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but Olivia's hand lingered on his arm, her gaze soft and familiar. Emma's chest tightened, and before she knew what she was doing, she turned and walked away, her footsteps quick and silent down the empty corridor. She couldn't do this anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that she was okay with being an outsider, with watching him move seamlessly through a world she could never understand. By the time she reached her room, her mind was made up. She would leave. She would go back to New York, to her life, to a place where she didn't feel like a stranger. She began packing her things, her hands trembling as she shoved clothes into her suitcase. She'd thought she could handle this, thought she could separate herself from the role she was playing. But her heart had betrayed her, and now it was shattered, the pieces slipping through her fingers. She zipped up her suitcase, taking a shaky breath as she looked around the room one last time. This was it. She had to walk away before she lost herself completely. The Prescott mansion was transformed for the Christmas Eve ball, the halls glittering with strings of golden lights and fresh garlands that filled the air with a sweet, piney scent. Emma stood at the top of the staircase, her heart pounding as she took in the scene below. Guests mingling in elegant gowns and tuxedos, champagne glasses sparkling in the glow of the chandeliers, laughter floating up to meet her. She clutched her small clutch bag, her palms damp as she scanned the crowd. Even in the beautiful gown Daniel had arranged for her, a deep red, with a sweep of fabric that hugged her waist before flowing down in a cascade of silk, she felt out of place. She tried to quiet the voice in her head that told her she didn't belong here, but it lingered, growing louder with every passing moment. Emma. She turned to see Daniel, looking impossibly handsome in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, his expression soft as he took her in. His eyes lingered, a glimmer of warmth in their depths. "You look incredible." She felt her cheeks heat, the compliment both thrilling and terrifying. "Thank you. You clean up pretty well yourself." He chuckled, extending a hand. "Dance with me?" She hesitated, but the warmth in his gaze melted her defenses. She slipped her hand into his, and he led her down the staircase and onto the ballroom floor. The music shifted to a slow, romantic melody, and Daniel placed a steady hand on her waist, pulling her close as they swayed to the music. As they danced, Emma found herself relaxing, the tension easing from her shoulders. The crowd faded into the background, leaving only him, the warmth of his hand, the softness in his gaze. She looked up at him, feeling her heart race as she whispered, "Daniel, what are we doing?" His expression softened, and he leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, I don't want this to be pretend. Not anymore." Her heart stuttered at his words, a mixture of joy and fear flooding her chest. "But we're so different. Your world, your family. I don't belong here." He shook his head, his gaze never leaving hers. "Emma, you belong with me. That's all that matters." She wanted to believe him, to let herself fall into the warmth of his words, but the doubts lingered, a heavy weight on her heart. "It's just hard to imagine fitting in here. Olivia, your family, they look at me like I'm some kind of outsider." Daniel's hand tightened on hers, his voice firm. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care about you. You're the one I want here, Emma." For a heartbeat, she felt the walls around her heart begin to crumble, the fears and insecurities melting away. She looked up at him, her heart pounding as she whispered, I think I'm falling for you." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and for a moment she feared she'd said too much. But Daniel's eyes softened, a hint of vulnerability in his gaze as he reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Emma, I'm falling for you too." He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a soft, tentative kiss. She closed her eyes, letting herself get lost in the warmth of his touch, the quiet promise of his words. It was as if the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a moment that felt both fragile and unbreakable. But before they could pull away, a voice cut through the quiet, sharp and familiar. "Daniel." Emma felt her heart sink as Margaret approached, her face a mask of polite disapproval. She looked at Emma with a cool, assessing gaze before turning to Daniel. "Daniel, your father would like to speak with you." Daniel glanced at Emma, an apology in his eyes. "I'll be right back," he whispered, brushing his fingers along her hand before stepping away. As he disappeared into the crowd, Emma felt the magic of the moment slip through her fingers, leaving her alone in the middle of the bustling ballroom. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold on to the warmth of his words. But the doubts were already creeping back in, threatening to undo everything. She made her way to the edge of the room, grabbing a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. She took a sip, her gaze fixed on the glittering lights overhead as she tried to steady her racing heart. "Enjoying yourself?" a voice said beside her. Emma turned, her stomach sinking as she saw Olivia standing there, her smile cool and knowing. Olivia took a slow sip of her own champagne, her eyes sweeping over Emma's gown before settling back on her face. "Quite the dress," she remarked, her tone just a shade too sweet. Emma forced a smile, refusing to let Olivia see the hurt simmering beneath the surface. "Thank you." Olivia's smile widened, a hint of satisfaction gleaming in her eyes. "You know, I was surprised when I heard about you and Daniel. It's just sudden, don't you think?" Emma stiffened, feeling the sting of Olivia's words like tiny barbs. "I don't see how that's any of your business." Olivia tilted her head, studying Emma with a look that felt both condescending and pitying. "Oh, I didn't mean to offend. It's just, well, you must know how different our worlds are. Daniel's family has a certain standard, you understand. I just hope you're ready for what that means." Emma's chest tightened, the words cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She forced herself to stay calm, reminding herself that Olivia didn't know the whole story. But as she glanced back across the room, where Daniel stood with his family, her heart ached with the realization that maybe Olivia was right. Maybe she was out of her depth here, playing a role she could never truly fill. Without another word, Emma turned and slipped out of the ballroom, the cool night air hitting her like a splash of water as she stepped onto the terrace. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the snow-covered landscape as she tried to make sense of the mess of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't know how long she stood there, but eventually, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Daniel, his expression full of concern as he approached her. "Emma," he said softly, reaching for her hand. "What's wrong?" She shook her head, pulling her hand away as she struggled to keep her voice steady. "Daniel, I don't know if I can do this. Your family, your world, it's too much. I feel like I'm just pretending." He looked at her, his eyes filled with hurt and frustration. "Emma, this isn't pretend for me. I meant what I said. I want you here." She swallowed, her heart aching with the weight of his words. "But for how long, Daniel? How long until this all falls apart, and I'm left feeling like an outsider again?" He reached for her hand, his grip firm and steady. "Emma, I don't want anyone else. I don't care about the differences or what anyone else thinks. You're the one I want." She looked up at him, the sincerity in his gaze unraveling her carefully built defenses. For a moment, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this could work. She took a shaky breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "Daniel, But before she could finish, he leaned in and kissed her, his arms wrapping around her as if he were anchoring her to this moment, this life they were building together. She closed her eyes, letting herself get lost in the warmth of his touch, the unspoken promise in his embrace. When they finally pulled away, he looked at her, a soft smile on his lips. "Stay with me, Emma." She nodded, the last of her doubts fading into the night. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She wanted to face them with him, no matter what it took. The Christmas Eve ball had left Emma's mind buzzing, every moment replaying in vivid detail. The warmth of Daniel's hand, the softness in his gaze, the quiet promise in his kiss. And yet, no matter how hard she tried to hold on to those memories, doubts kept seeping in like shadows, leaving her feeling colder and more alone than ever. By the time morning came, Emma had made up her mind. She couldn't keep playing this role, couldn't keep pretending to be someone who fit so seamlessly into Daniel's world. The hurtful words from Olivia, the wary looks from Daniel's family, and her own insecurities had all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. She didn't belong here. With a heavy heart, she pulled her suitcase from the closet and began packing, each item she folded feeling like a small goodbye. She could barely think about what leaving would mean, about how much it would hurt to walk away from Daniel. but staying felt impossible. She had to go before she lost herself completely. As she zipped up her suitcase, she heard a knock on the door. Her heart skipped, and she took a steadying breath before opening it, hoping she could hold her resolve. But when she saw Daniel standing there, the concern etched across his face, her resolve wavered. "Emma?" he asked, his voice soft, his gaze dropping to her suitcase. "What's going on?" She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm leaving, Daniel." His face fell, a flicker of hurt crossing his features. "Why?" "Emma, if this is about last night, about Olivia." She shook her head, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "It's not just about Olivia. It's everything, Daniel. Your family, your life, all of this. I thought I could handle it, but I don't fit in here. I never have." He reached out, his voice filled with quiet urgency. "Emma, don't say that. You're not an outsider. You're here because I want you here. Isn't that enough?" Her heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but the words she needed to say were lodged in her throat. She took a shaky breath, trying to keep herself together. "Daniel, you deserve someone who belongs in your world. Someone who doesn't feel like a stranger every time she walks into a room." He stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "Emma, you're the one I want. Not someone else, not anyone who fits. Just you." His words were soft, filled with a desperation that made her want to believe him. She could feel the warmth of his hand, the unspoken promise in his touch. But her insecurities, her fears, they were louder. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This world isn't mine. You know it, and I know it." He looked at her, pain flashing in his eyes. "Emma, please. Don't do this. We can make it work. We don't have to fit anyone's expectations." She forced herself to pull her hand away, her heart breaking with every inch of distance. "I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't do this." The silence between them felt heavy, as if the words they'd left unspoken were pressing down on them both. She looked away, unable to bear the hurt in his gaze. "Goodbye, Daniel." With one last, lingering glance, she stepped out of the room, her suitcase rolling quietly behind her. She didn't look back, afraid that if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to leave. Each step felt like a weight pressing down on her, a reminder of everything she was giving up, of the life she'd never dared to dream of until now. The taxi ride to the airport passed in a blur, her mind numb as she stared out the window, watching the snow-covered landscape roll by. The ache in her chest felt like it would never fade, a hollow, aching reminder of everything she'd left behind. She clutched her suitcase, holding herself together as best as she could. When her flight finally took off, she looked out the window, watching Vermont disappear beneath a blanket of white. She'd come here as part of a ridiculous pretend arrangement, a paid fiancé, someone hired to play a role. But she was leaving with something real, something that felt too big for her heart to hold. Back in New York, everything felt strange and empty. Her tiny apartment, once her sanctuary, now seemed cold and foreign. Her paintings, which had always brought her a sense of pride, felt lifeless. She'd left a part of herself in Vermont, with Daniel, and now she wasn't sure who she was without it. Emma threw herself into her work, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of paint and canvas. She poured her heart into every stroke, hoping that somehow she could paint away the hurt. But every brushstroke reminded her of him, the softness in his eyes, the warmth of his hand, the way he'd looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake him from her mind. Every street corner, every quiet night felt haunted by his memory, as if he were lingering in the shadows of her life, refusing to let her move on. Christmas came and went, the city's festive cheer only highlighting her loneliness. She watched couples walk hand in hand through the snow, their laughter echoing down the narrow streets, while she felt like a ghost, drifting through a world that no longer felt like hers. One night, as she sat alone in her studio, a blank canvas in front of her, her phone buzzed on the table. She ignored it at first, too lost in her thoughts to care. But when it buzzed again, she glanced down, her heart racing when she saw an unknown number. "Emma," the message read. "I know I shouldn't be texting, but I can't stop thinking about you. Please let me see you." Her hands shook as she read the message, her heart leaping with a mix of hope and fear. She knew who it was. She would recognize his words anywhere. For a moment she hesitated, her mind racing with questions and doubts. She wanted to respond, to tell him everything she hadn't been able to say when she'd left. But a part of her was still afraid that it would end in heartbreak, that she'd fall even deeper and lose herself completely. Taking a deep breath, she typed out a reply, her fingers trembling as she hit send. Whatever happened next, she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't walk away again. Christmas morning dawned cold and clear in New York City, the world outside covered in a layer of soft, glistening snow. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with the memory of Daniel's message from the night before. She'd barely slept, replaying every word, every emotion it had stirred in her, wondering if this was all just a dream. She was still lost in thought when she heard a knock on her door. Her heart skipped as she checked the clock. Who could be visiting her at this hour? On Christmas morning, no less. Wrapping her sweater around her, she opened the door. Her breath caught as she took in the figure standing in the hallway, dusted with snow and clutching a small, neatly wrapped gift. "Daniel?" she whispered, hardly believing her eyes. He offered a tentative smile, a hint of vulnerability in his gaze as he held out the gift. "Merry Christmas, Emma." She stared at him, her emotions a whirlwind. What are you doing here?" He took a deep breath, the words spilling out in a rush. "I couldn't stay away. After you left, I realized I didn't want to live in a world where you weren't there. I don't care about anyone's expectations, Emma. I only care about you." Her heart pounded as his words sank in, and for a moment, she was too stunned to speak. "Daniel, I didn't think you'd—" He shook his head, stepping closer, his voice soft, but unwavering. "I don't want to lose you, Emma. I love you. And if you need me to walk away from everything else to be with you, I will." The words left her breathless. She felt tears prickling at her eyes, the hope she'd buried deep inside her finally breaking free. She took a step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you too, Daniel. I think I always have." He exhaled, his face breaking into a relieved smile as he reached for her hand. The warmth of his touch chased away the last of her doubts, filling her with a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. For the first time, she let herself believe that maybe this love wasn't just a dream, that it was real, solid, something she could hold on to. He handed her the small box, his eyes bright with something unspoken. "Here, I got this for you." She opened the box, her fingers trembling as she peeled back the paper. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, a single snowflake charm glinting in the morning light. She touched it, her heart swelling as she realized its significance. A symbol of their time together, of the warmth they'd shared even in the coldest moments. "Daniel, it's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He reached out, gently fastening the necklace around her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine. "It reminded me of you," he murmured. "Unique, beautiful, impossible to forget." She looked up at him, the joy in her heart shining through her smile. "Thank you." They stood there in the quiet of her apartment, the world outside forgotten. For the first time, Emma felt truly at peace, as if she'd finally found her place. Not in his world, not in hers, but somewhere new they could build together. They spent the day together, wandering through the snowy streets, stopping for coffee in tiny cafes, and talking about everything. Their past, their fears, and all the small moments they'd never shared. By the time the sun began to set, Emma knew that whatever happened, she wanted to face it with him. She was finally ready to believe in the future they could create together. As the city lights flickered to life, casting a warm glow over the snow-covered streets, they stopped on a quiet corner, surrounded by the muffled sounds of holiday cheer. Daniel took her hand, his gaze steady as he looked down at her. "Emma," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want it with you." She felt a smile spread across her face, her heart brimming with hope. "I want that too." He leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that felt like a promise. A quiet vow that no matter where life took them, they would face it together. And in that moment, Emma knew that she'd found something real, something worth fighting for. The new year stretched out before them like a blank canvas, waiting to be painted with all the colors of their future. For the first time, she was ready to embrace it, with him, and for as long as they could hold on to each other. The snow crunched beneath Emma's boots as she and Daniel walked hand in hand through the frosty grounds of the Prescott family estate. It was New Year's Eve, and they'd returned to Vermont for the final holiday gathering of the season. Emma had felt a jolt of nervousness upon stepping back into the mansion. But Daniel had squeezed her hand, his smile steady and reassuring. This time she didn't feel like an outsider. With him by her side, she felt at home. They stopped by a grove of snow-covered trees, where delicate strings of lights glowed softly in the early evening light. Emma gazed up at the twinkling lights, feeling a warmth spread through her chest as she realized how far they'd come. "Hard to believe it's only been a few weeks since we met," Daniel said, his voice filled with wonder. Emma looked up at him, smiling. "It feels like longer, like I've known you for ages." He grinned, pulling her close. "You know, I never thought I'd find something like this. I've always followed the path my family expected, never really questioned it. But you changed everything." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "You showed me that I could be part of something bigger than just my own little world, that I don't have to be afraid to let someone in." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as snowflakes drifted down from the sky, each one glinting in the soft light. Emma's fingers brushed against the snowflake necklace he'd given her, a small smile tugging at her lips. It was a reminder of everything they'd been through, of the challenges they'd faced and overcome together. Daniel took her hands, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity that made her breath catch. "Emma, I want you to know, whatever happens, wherever life takes us, I'm here, and I don't ever want to lose you." Emma looked up at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and gratitude. She thought of the journey they'd taken to get here, the doubts, the insecurities, the fears they'd both carried. And yet, here they were, standing together, ready to face whatever came next. "Me neither," she whispered, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "This, what we have, it's everything I never knew I needed." They spent the rest of the evening back inside, mingling with the family as laughter and holiday music filled the air. Margaret gave Emma a small, approving smile as she passed, a subtle acknowledgement that felt like a stamp of acceptance. Even Daniel's older brother Andrew managed a polite nod of approval. But none of that mattered as much as the feeling she held in her heart, that she belonged here, not because of who she was expected to be, but because of who she was with Daniel. As the clock approached midnight, Daniel led her outside to the terrace, the muffled sounds of the party fading behind them. The estate's gardens were blanketed in snow, glistening beneath a sky filled with stars. It was peaceful, quiet, and the world seemed to hold its breath as the countdown began. 10 seconds. Daniel took her hands, pulling her close, his gaze soft and steady. 9, 8. Emma looked up at him, feeling a rush of joy and love that filled every corner of her heart. 5, 4. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emma, Happy New Year." 3, 2. She smiled, her heart pounding. "Happy New Year, Daniel." 1. As the last second faded into the night, Daniel pressed his lips to hers, his arms wrapping around her in a kiss that felt like a promise, a quiet vow that whatever the future held, they would face it together. When they finally pulled apart, she looked up at him, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "So, what now?" He grinned, pulling her close as he brushed a stray snowflake from her hair. "Now, we write our own story." And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Emma knew that this was only the beginning, the start of a new life, a new love, and a new year filled with endless possibilities. If you liked the video, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription will show that I'm on the right path to bring you the best videos ever. Check this video out too. You are waking up one day to find out you're the secret daughter of a billionaire. That's exactly what happened to Amelia Hayes, a small-town waitress who gets thrown into the glitzy, cutthroat world of New York's elite,